Hi friends, host Eric here, host of Talking with Famous People. I'd like to discuss this email I received. It says, I have an ENTP friend who thinks he's an INTP, who often describes himself as broken with a capital B. Of course, I'm sure there are circumstances unique to him that factor in, but I'd like to understand where this general ENTP brokenness stems from. One, to be able to better understand him, and two, to determine whether or not to continue the ENTP conversation. He seemed saddened and confused when I first suggested it, I assume because I'm pushing on his TI somehow. Well, let me start at the top. So, obviously, if you get it, whenever I receive an email like this, I have to factor in that the person who's writing it may or may not be right about the person they're talking about, right? So, I don't know if this guy's friend is actually an ENTP or actually an INTP, but to describe himself as broken with a capital B uh, sounds like kind of an ENTP thing to do. It could be either, really. Regardless, forgetting about the circumstances unique to him, I would like to also understand and explain where this general ENTP brokenness stems from. So, it's part of FI polar, and it's FI polar that is modified, so to speak, by SE8TE6, such that we're not quite as impractical as INTPs, but we also have less of a sense of self. So perhaps the type that has the least sense of self of all is the ENTJ, because they've got FI fourth and they've got SI seventh. Those are the two functions that link to sense of self. For ENTPs, it's the other way around. SI fourth and FI seventh. And it's that combination of placements that probably produces the least successful engagement with a given function or a given function pair, right? So, you could say like INFJ perhaps, or even ENFJ, has less of a sense of self because their FI is on the back slot and their SI as well, right? But INFJ has FI 6 and SI 8, which means there's an instrumentality to them that causes them not to be missed, particularly as absolute values. So I guess there's two impact areas here. One is a lack of sense of self, and the second is an awareness that you're missing something, or actually missing something. So in other words, if it's only in instrumental spots, those SI and FI, then you're not really missing anything. It's not that you're not noticing that you're missing anything, you actually aren't missing anything. Your expression of self is such that those things are instrumental and aren't lacking, therefore. In ENTP with FI 7, in ENTJ as well with SI 7 and FI 4th, there's enough sense of self and an absolute sense of self among the two, such that there's a kind of awareness of the lack and an ache about it. For an ENTP, that manifests as, at the end of the day, when the playtime's all done, you have to be by yourself, and there's a hollowness to that takes a while to get over, and or to get past, I guess. I don't feel like I'm lacking in a sense of self anymore. I don't feel like I'm broken with a capital B. But there were plenty of years when I did, especially when I was drinking. But forgetting about the drinking even, the reason I burst into tears the first time I encountered MBTI types, which remarkably was not until I was like 30 years old. And then I didn't encounter cognitive functions until my 40s. But regardless, the first time I read my MBTI type description, and it was obvious I was an ENTP immediately by just looking at the type descriptions. I took the test, tested ENTP, took another test, tested ENTP, read the type descriptions, determined myself to be obviously ENTP by the type descriptions as well. But the first time I read the type description of ENTP, I burst into tears because it was like, oh, that's what's wrong with me. The fact is, being an intuition dom means being as in your dominant nature. It means having the least sensory relationship with one's cognition that you can have, and it's maximally so in the intuition dominants who have another communicative function second. So that's your ENTPs, INTPs, INFJs, ENFJs that start with, well, I mean, actually the ones that are intuition dominants are it's just the ENTP and INFJ who are maximally communicative. For INTJs, they've got, they've got TEFI in the 2-3, so they have a much clearer sense of self. And for ENFPs, they've got FI tool, obviously, and TE in the third slot. And they have both SI and FI on the front stack, so they have a very clear sense of self in some sense, but it's burdensome to them because everything gets expressed in terms of regrets and against ideals, contrasted against ideals. But anyway, back to ENTP. How does an ENTP come to be unbroken? Well, I mean, the thing that both ESTP and ENTP have in different ways and express in different ways is this combination of brashness and vulnerability that they project continually onto the world. It's as though we're unable to see how vulnerable we appear to other people, how much it appears that we're displaying insecurities and or trying to fight against insecurities or something like that. It's got to explain why we're so third slot FE. In reality, part of becoming free of the implicit handicaps of being an ENTP, it starts with kind of acknowledging that stuff's important to you and that's okay. Well, why do you care so much what other people think is an FI kind of question, right? And it gets kind of projected onto all of us as a value we should uphold, that it's not good to care what other people think too much. Well, of course, if you add too much to anything, it's not good, but the thing is, it's also important to accept yourself for who you are, and I'm not going to hold myself accountable to standards that don't really apply to me, like that one, I do care what other people think. That doesn't mean I'm controlled by it in any sense. It's more like a course corrector, When people don't like me, it makes me correct my course. Whether you should continue the ENTP conversation. If he really is an ENTP, and he really does feel broken, then he needs to hear the message, there's nothing wrong with you. And that's what you should tell him. There's nothing wrong with you. And then maybe continue the ENTP conversation, or say, watch this video that Eric made in response to my email. Maybe say that, It's hard being an ENTP. I'll tell you that. It's hard. It was hard for 42 years, for me. And it's still hard, actually. It's been hard for 50 years. My life changed a lot after I quit drinking. But I actually became, by objective standards, less successful. So, I was at my best in terms of achieving on societal standards when I was drunk, and therefore unable to exercise my vision much, having to always just sort of not push back and go along to get along in order to protect my drinking, to hide the fact that I was drinking, in order to not, I was always afraid that somebody was aware, people knew somehow or whatever, and that they were going to use it against me. And it made me compliant. And when I was compliant, I was much more successful. So, now I'm not very compliant, but I'm also not very successful. So there you have it. But the thing is, I wouldn't trade it for the world. Obviously, I'm a much more happy and complete person today than I was back then, even though I may have been more successful. I'm somewhat less competitive. When I was a coach, I was like had the big kudos team especially. But all the time I've been a coach, especially, well, not the last couple of years really, but before that, I was very competitive. I expected my kids to win all the time. And there were stretches where we kicked so much ass, it was unbelievable. And yet, I was broken with a capital B. So, part of the problem for your friend here may be linked to a specific drug like alcohol or some other thing that he can't handle and he's doing too much of. In which case he needs to stop that drug without buying into the whole stop everything bullshit, because it probably won't work for him. Or if he doesn't have that kind of substance abuse issue, then it starts with recognizing, I guess, to some extent, it might help anyway. I didn't have this ever, but it might help to recognize that there's somebody who's walked this path before you, and who understands how difficult it is, and who understands the desperate need of ENTPs to be told there's nothing wrong with you. You are okay. You have worth regardless of your utility. And for the ENTP to come to believe that. And it's a challenge when you're FI polar, but through that kind of self-care, self-love stuff that is kind of hackneyed but matters a lot, you can grow to feel pretty good about yourself. It's like, even today, I still seem to walk around with a great deal of dread, linking to my bad TE and iffy SI and just general, not pulling my shit, like not working hard enough, not making enough money, cruising while I can here because I'm living here at my dad's house for rent free, and it constantly weighs me down, right? Because of course, until a couple of years ago, my whole adult life, I rented this one house in Temple City for 20 years. I lived in Laverne, and obviously I haven't lived with my parents in a long time, but I had good reason to come back here when I did. My dad needed a lot of help with my mom, and then you settle in and you get comfortable. So I carry around still a lot of dread about that. The fact that I'm too comfortable, that that if I couldn't live here, that in my current affairs, I couldn't really afford to live. It's like not around LA anyway. not and support Rachel anyway. So that constantly gives me anxiety, I guess. I'm constantly carrying it around, it seems like. And that tells me right off the bat that I haven't got it all figured out at all, you know? It's like I'm certainly not enlightened or actualized in some sense where I'm happy, joyous, and free all the time, right? So I'm not really sure how possible that is or desirable that is. In order to get to that spot of happy, joyous, and free, you have to spend all your time doing spirituality shit, which is just like, fuck that noise, right? I don't got time for that shit. Anyhow, that's my thoughts on this. Thanks for the email, and hopefully maybe you can get your friend to watch this video. Regardless of whether you're an ENTP or an INTP, you know. If you think you're an INTP because you're constantly being logical, it's actually more a trait of ENTPs, right, as a tool function. We have a tendency to overuse the old TI. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to eat plenty of cheese. Praise the Lord, pass the bananas. Amen. And Eric is right.